The N64, the precursor to the GameCube that truly cemented some of the greatest games of all time for me. Games like Super Mario 64, Banjo-Kazooie, GoldenEye, Perfect Dark, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, and so many more. When the GameCube was announced, I began to wonder which N64 games we'd see sequels that would make their way to the upcoming console. In this episode, I decided to share the games that I wish came to the GameCube in some capacity, whether a sequel or a follow-up. To make the list more interesting though, none of the rare published and developed games will be mentioned here, as that will be another episode in the future that I feel needs a more dedicated video. Also, my good friend Andy, aka Pac-Man Case, joins in again to provide 2 of his picks on this list, while I share 8 of my picks. So, with that being said, let's dive into this topic.
What is up, GCG Nation? Pac-Man Case is here with you again to start this list off on the N64 games that we wish would have gotten a sequel on the GameCube. My first pick is gonna be Buck Bumble. This game is set in London, England, where a chemical reactor plant melts down to create evil mutant insects. These insects call themselves the Herd with their evil queen, and they are hell-bent on taking out that garden and then the world. What are we to do? Well, there's a resistance that hires on Buck Bumble, a genetically modified bumblebee that has soaring fighting capabilities and blasters like none other, and his job is to go dogfight his way to freedom. This game not only has awesome mechanics in the same vein as Star Fox, but it also accompanies a pretty amazing soundtrack, especially for the N64. I don't know why this game went under the radar, but because it did, we missed out on them developing an entire sequel onto the GameCube, which would have been a lot of fun to go get us some Top Gun vein Bumblebee action for a sequel that never happened. So that's my first one. Marcello, let's keep rocking this list.
Awesome game to kick off the list, Andy. So my first pick is going to go to Body Harvest, published by Midway and developed by DMA Design. Here is a very ambitious game for the N64 that in many ways was a precursor to Grand Theft Auto 3, as DMA Design went on to make that game afterwards. This semi-open world experience has you in control of Adam Drake, one of Earth's last remaining survivors, in a war against aliens. In his escape from the space station he was on, he travels back in time to stop the alien invasions that occur throughout the decades. Each time period is separated into 4 sections, with the first 3 sections being legitimately lengthy areas, and the 4th being strictly a boss battle, although there are mini bosses at the end of each section as well. Adam can freely run around a fairly massive environment littered with vehicles to take for use. At times, aliens will teleport into the area, whether to try and stop you or harvest living humans in their villages. If they harvest on too many humans in a time period, as indicated in the heads-up display, the apocalypse will reign and will result in a game over. Throughout the journey, you will also explore indoor locations, which usually resorts to some puzzle solving, NPC chats, or just nabbing items that could be of use. This is a game I always loved back in the day and an absolute hidden gem for the N64. It's just a shame that nothing ever became of this IP and it was just one and done, as I would have loved a sequel on newer hardware like the GameCube. Next up is Nintendo's Excitebike 64, which was developed by Left Field Productions. Excitebike is a franchise that has been interesting for Nintendo. We first saw it on home consoles with the NES, and then it was not until the N64 that we'd see a sequel for the franchise, and then it returned somewhat as a spiritual successor on the Wii with Excite Truck, followed by Excitebots, and finally Excitebike World Rally through the WiiWare service. Excitebike 64 is a game that does a very admirable job transitioning the gameplay from the 2D into the 3D setting. Choosing from one of several riders, each with their own stats, you tackle races through both indoor stadium tracks as well as outdoor terrain tracks. Excitebike was always about balancing the temperature gauge and knowing when to use your turbo effectively and not overheat. Additionally, the series was always known for strategically hitting jumps and trying to land downward to maintain that speed. This installment does bring back those specific elements that define Excitebike, and it's honestly a fun and very challenging time. Add in the various mini games here that are a blast, the original NES game to unlock and play, and a full track editor that is so much fun to use, and Excitebike 64 is just a great game overall. Why did Nintendo skip out on bringing this to the GameCube as well after this release? Next up is Konami's Castlevania 64 and Castlevania Legacy of Darkness. I'm going to start by stating that I'm in the minority camp that loves these games, and I am a die-hard Castlevania fan. Granted, Legacy of Darkness is a more content-heavy upgrade to the original Castlevania 64, and it's basically the version that should have just released the first time. While these are not considered canon with the Castlevania universe, I love the premise and lore built within the game. Castlevania 64 introduced players to Reinhard Schneider, the new wielder of the Vampire Killer, as well as Carrie Fernandez, a girl imbued with magical abilities. Exploring the game's 10 stages, each of which are pretty vast, you will fight off against Dracula's minions while solving puzzles and platforming much like the series is known for. Each character plays entirely different and also has 3 exclusive levels to experience each. The game was also ahead of its time in some ways, with the day-night cycle affecting rooms that you can open and sequences that you can initiate within the levels. And for a series about vampires, this installment really emphasizes on fighting vampires. Heck, if not careful, a vampire can actually turn your hero or heroine into a creature of the night. Granted, that does result in a game over, of course, but still, this game had some serious attention to detail. And if this wasn't enough, Legacy of Darkness introduced players with 2 more characters to play as, Cornell and the unlockable Henry. Cornell is part human, part werewolf, and is on a search to rescue his sister from Dracula. He throws projectiles at enemies and can turn into a werewolf at a whim to dish out serious damage at the cost of red jewels. Beating the game unlocks Henry, which gives players a very unique experience as well, in which he must rescue captive children within Dracula's island, and also utilizes a gun as his main weapon. Legacy of Darkness also went the extra mile with including Reinhardt and Carrie's campaigns as well, making this one hell of a package. Sure, the camera sucks at times, and sure, the game can be unforgiving with platforming that sends you back to either your last save point or the beginning of the level, but the overall gameplay coupled with its superbly crafted soundtrack always made this one of my favorites for the N64. And yet, Konami neglected to bring a single Castlevania game to the GameCube, which I actually mentioned in my more recent PS2 games I wish that were ported to the GameCube episode. Oh, and screw the Nitro sequence with Reinhardt and Carrie in this game. If you know, you know. Next up are Nintendo and Midway's Cruis'n trilogy of games, Cruis'n USA, Cruis'n World, and Cruis'n Exotica. I'm cheating a bit here by including 3 games for a single topic point, but they are essentially the same core arcade racing experiences. Here is a racing series that I always loved, whether playing them in the arcade or playing the N64 home conversion ports. I have fond memories playing Cruis'n USA at a friend's house early in the N64's life cycle, and Cruis'n World and Exotica more so in the arcade. These games were all about racing as fast as possible to the finish line of each track, while dodging traffic in the process. They were all simple pick-up-and-play racing games that were great in short bursts, or even for longer stretches of gaming. Each game's home port was handled by a different developer though, with Williams handling Cruis'n USA, Eurocom handling Cruis'n World, and Gratuitous Games handling Cruis'n Exotica. The core gameplay is similar, but I will say the controls and physics feel different amongst the three games. Cruis'n World is considered many people's favorite in the trilogy here, and it does feel the most polished for sure. Unfortunately, the Cruis'n series skipped the GameCube, but did receive an exclusive installment for the Game Boy Advance called Cruis'n Velocity that is, well, it's not quite Cruis'n material, let's say. When the Wii released though, Midway took the Fast and Furious arcade game, made some tweaks to it, and changed the title to Cruis'n. While it got trashed critically for its poor visuals and lack of polish, I actually still had a blast with it back then. And speaking of blast, it was not until 15 years later that a new installment launched with Cruis'n Blast on the Switch, which if you haven't played that yet, I highly recommend you pick that up right away. Alright, continuing with another racer on the N64 is Top Gear Rally. This is a racing game I have fond memories sinking countless hours into, whether through the game's season mode or just messing around with time trials. This racer, developed by Boss Studios, provided players with a very arcade-style rally racer that also had a ton of customization for its time. You could customize the steering style to be either tighter or looser, you can change the suspension type, and even the tires. The physics in place here were impressive in my opinion, and while the handling could take some slight getting used to, once you do, it just all feels natural. Racing across 4 stages throughout the season mode, each track will have different weather types that change the feel of the track, as well as the car's handling. Whether driving along the coastline, the jungle, the desert, or the mountain, each track is superbly crafted, with shortcuts waiting to be found, and are essential to taking the lead amongst the 19 other racers on the track. The game's soundtrack is also done by Barry Leach, who made the soundtrack for the SNES Top Gear games, but also more recently, Horizon Chase Turbo. There's also a full decal editor mode that lets you create whatever look you want your car of choice to have, and it's quite intricate. There's several unlockables too, like a 5th track to race on called the Strip Mine, a milk truck, and a football helmet car. The game's visuals are also really good, with full damage modeling on the car when hitting walls. Seriously, this game is an absolute blast. There was a sequel on the N64, Top Gear Rally 2, which was developed by Sapphire this time around, and that game sucked, honestly. I did not like that game. It's a shame, because the foundation in Top Gear Rally 1 is so damn good, and I would have loved to see a new installment following the foundation for this onto the GameCube. Switching things up a bit is a title that many seem to hate, and that is Earthworm Jim 3D. Being a huge fan of Earthworm Jim 1 and 2, as well as the Saturday morning cartoon series, Earthworm Jim 3D was the first time we'd seen Jim in a 3D setting. Sorry, Clay Fighter 63 1/3 does not count. Earthworm Jim 3D was not made by the same team as the original two, but was rather handed off to Vis Entertainment, and shockingly was published by Rockstar Games. In this game, our hero Earthworm Jim is suffering from head trauma due to an accident and is trying to fight his inner demons or crazy ideas to stay alive within his own mind. Instead of this being a hardcore 2D action platformer, here is a game that tries to match platformers of its era, in which you collect green marbles scattered across levels and find golden udders by completing certain objectives. However, Jim does have his handy blaster to take out a variety of enemies and can still pick up other weapons as well. He still has his signature head whip attack as well. Now, there's no denying the game here does have issues, like the horrendous camera for example, but at the same time, I actually found myself enjoying this quite a bit. I also love that Dan Castellaneta reprises his role as Earthworm Jim just like he did in the cartoon series. Despite it not being great, this was the last we saw Earthworm Jim with a new installment. Earthworm Jim HD doesn't quite count being a PS3 360 remake of the original game. All that being said, I wish more was done with this series after this, and think the power of the GameCube would have aided in bringing an even better Earthworm Jim follow-up. Sticking with collectathon platformers is the Gex series, with both Gex 64 Enter the Gecko and Gex 3 Deep Cover Gecko being on the N64. For the sake of this video though, I will only showcase Gex 64 as Gex 3 was not working on my console for some reason during recording. Anyway, Gex has had an interesting legacy, and tended to be a 3DO mascot on that console back in the mid-90s, then made its way to the PS1 and Sega Saturn, and then it was not until later on that Gex Enter the Gecko changed the formula from being a side-scrolling game to a 3D collectathon. Enter the Gecko has comedian Dana Gould reprise his role as Gex, quoting various pop culture references and lines throughout gameplay. Gex adventures through various TV channels, each of which are specifically themed, and has to find red remote controls to help him advance through the hub world. The farther he advances, the farther he gets to closing in on Rez, the villain that brought him into this world. This is a game I always loved, and while I never got around to completing Gex 3 back in the day, I always anticipated a follow-up for the series on the next round of consoles. But seeing that this was the last we'd seen of Gex is just honestly really sad. If you've never played these games before, I highly recommend checking them out on either the N64 or the PS1.
Has anyone seen Fox Mulder's sister?
Okay, so there's one more platformer that Andy, aka Pac-Man Case, wants to share on this list before we get to my personal final pick. So, Andy, take it away.
Alright guys, my next pick for N64 games that deserved a sequel on the GameCube is Rocket Robot on Wheels. Now this is a very unique game as it is Sucker Punch's first developed game and on the Nintendo 64. But this game is even crazier when it gets to the plot. This is set in Whoopi's world, a theme park that is about to open up, and Rocket's creator has to head off to a party and leave Rocket to maintain the park himself. Unfortunately, the park has a mascot named Whoopi the Walrus and his sidekick Jojo the Raccoon. Well, Jojo's tired of being second fiddle and ends up creating a plan to take the park all down. Now it's up to Rocket to bring the park back to life and save it from the clutches of Jojo the Raccoon. This is a very interesting platformer, physics-based puzzle game that takes Rocket and has him go collect gears and keys and parts of the park to put it all back together. The platforming is super fun. The music has a really swanky piano jazzy vibe throughout the entire game. And the game itself is pretty phenomenal for an N64 title, which is surprising that it didn't have enough love to get itself a sequel on the GameCube, because Rocket Robot on Wheels 2 would have been even more robot. Marcello, back to you, man.
To wrap up my picks are Atlus's Snowboard Kid games. Imagine Mario Kart on snowboards, and that sums up Snowboard Kids perfectly. This quirky snowboard kart, is that a genre, racer has players duking it out against 3 other boarders on the slopes, acquiring weapons and using them to give you the advantage in races. Aside from the snowboarding component, there are other unique aspects to differentiate it from other kart racers. First off, the weapon/item system in this game allows for up to 2 different types of pickups, offense and defense. Offense items can be fired upon enemies ahead of you, while defense items may provide boosts or pans that can be dropped on all the riders. The tracks in these games are colorful and varied, whether riding traditional snow mountains, to jungles, to even boarding underwater. I also really like the idea of racing to the bottom of the track and trying to line up with where the lift takes you back to the top of the mountain for another lap. This could also be frustrating as the lift opens for only 1 rider at a time, but that's part of the challenge. This is a series that became a cult classic and was easily a hidden gem as well. It's a shame that it would end here though in terms of home console installments of the series, as the series did return for one final run on the DS, but it was quite different from its originals. It really is a shame there was no follow-up for this on the GameCube, because despite the mostly excellent variety of snowboarding games on the GameCube, this would have been another banger for the console. Now, these aren't the only N64 games that we wish got a GameCube follow-up. These were just ones that came to mind immediately when making this list that I have fond memories playing, and the same goes with Andy's picks as well. I do want to thank Pac-Man Case again for joining in on this collab, and if you haven't subbed to his channel yet, definitely go do that. He makes awesome retro gaming content that's creative and always top-notch quality. With that being said, which N64 games do you wish received a GameCube follow-up? Sound off in the comments below, as I always love to hear all your thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to check out the various other GameCube videos on the channel, subscribe if you haven't yet, and hit that notification bell so that you know when a new GameCube Galaxy video is out. I hope you all enjoyed, and I will catch you all in the next episode.